The Iranian government says it's ready to wrap up a new nuclear deal. But can an agreement be reached? Should an agreement be reached? Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warns of dangerous consequences if negotiations fail. He predicts without an accord, Middle East nations are at risk of engaging in an irreversible arms race. Well, joining us with more is Middle East Forum Director Gregg. So, Gregg, what's the hang-up at this time? What's preventing the U.S., Europe, and Iran from reaching a new joint comprehensive plan of action?
I think that this is a case of Europe and the United States finally realizing that the emperor has no clothes in Iran, especially since the Russians are now relying upon Iranian exports of drones and missile technology to hit at the joint European-funded front in Ukraine, and also realizing that they have no intention of helping the Iranians get a diplomatic or any policy win so long as their own people are calling for the overthrow of their government. The reason why I think the Russians are doubling down now is because they need a new front to try to engage Europe and the United States on, as Ukraine is not going very well for them. And they also owe their Iranian allies a little bit of a payback for what Iran has done to help the Russians try to bolster their forces in Ukraine. So if Russia and Iran are able to get back to the table, the Americans and Europeans realize that it's a loss for Europe and America if they are to acquiesce to what Iran is doing right now with Russia and Europe.
Yeah, this seems like a new equation here, because I remember George Bush used to refer to it as the axis of evil, including Iran, North Korea, and so forth. Now you've got Russia in there with Iran. What are the implications of that?
Well, look at Russia's involvement with Iran's nuclear program first and foremost. They've funded the building of Bushehr, Iran's first nuclear reactor. They've also sent Russian technology to help with some of Iran's other nuclear uranium enrichment and other centrifuge technologies. And now it's in Russia's interest to try to keep Iran close and to help them with whatever their policy needs are, because Russia's been shut off by most of the world, including even China to a certain extent, with their ability to import technology from Beijing. So Russia wants to give Iran a pass as it relates to their nuclear technology. And they're trying to rattle the saber of Iranian arms munitions production, which will threaten other Middle Eastern countries, even though it's Russia who's paying for Iran to be able to manufacture drones and missiles, which right now are being used against Ukraine, but could ostensibly used against Israel, Turkey, and other American Gulf allies tomorrow. So Russia's playing a double game. I think America and Europe have realized this, and they're not going to move the line towards a nuclear deal so long as Iran continues its belligerent behavior in the Middle East and continues to support Russia's offensive war against Ukraine.
I'm sure many of those, even in Israel, who favor a new agreement, say Israel would benefit because the development of the Iranian nuclear program would be slowed, monitored by the UN. What do you say?
I think Iran's most dramatic gains in its nuclear program were when it was a signatory to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Its ability to increase the building of infrastructure in areas like Isfahan and Shiraz, where there's uranium enrichment taking place, its ability to build its nuclear program in terms of the military capability, which was revealed by the Mossad in a daring raid where the Israeli intelligence agency was able to steal Iran's entire nuclear archive, demonstrably showing that progress on its military aspects did not stop when it signed its deal. So there may be those in favor of slowing down the Iranian nuclear project, but the offset to that is an increase in Iran's ability to, number one, first and foremost, wage war against its own citizens by having more monies come in that it can use to militarize populations that still support the regime. And number two, outside of Iran's borders, we saw an uptick in Iranian attacks against American allies in Iraq, its funding of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and its ability to bolster the Assad regime in Syria. So I think that you can have both a slowdown in the Iran nuclear project and the ability to stop funding Iranian terrorism by getting tougher with Iran and making sure that there's more demonstrable consequences leading up into a military strike against its nuclear facilities by pursuing other policy options, like supporting the revolution or by clamping down with more economic sanctions against Tehran.
Do you think we're seeing the beginning of the end of the Islamic regime, or is greater oppression coming?
I think you have the nucleus of what could be the beginning of the end of the Islamic regime in Iran, but it will be for naught if the protesters are not able to coalesce around common leadership. The one missing ingredient right now in these 90 to 120 days of protest, depending on where you have your starting point, is that there is no true leadership which is exhibited, them standing up to be the face of this revolution. And you can't have a faceless revolution because eventually it'll allow the current political elements to manipulate perhaps the overthrow of the Ayatollah, but with the replacement of someone who will continue their draconian policies towards their citizens, which is how they got here in the first place.
Well, on to Israel. It may not be smooth sailing for the newly formed government there. What's the biggest challenge facing Bibi Netanyahu at this time?
Well, there's two. The first is between the core members and backbenchers of his Likud party, who I would call your traditional conservative, lowercase liberals. I think you also have the second challenge, which is between Netanyahu and Jewish diaspora communities around the world, who in a joint letter from the Jewish Agency, the World Zionist Organization, and other diaspora representative bodies called for Israel to maintain its pluralistic characters and its Zionist upbringing. And then on the other hand, you had, as a result of this letter, the leader of one of the opposition parties in the Knesset say that this was the end of Zionism in the Knesset as it was known because of Bibi's new government. I think it's a lot of semantics. I think it's a lot of polemics. But I think at the end of the day, Netanyahu is going to have to walk a fine line between his own party and the Jewish diaspora, and then to meet the needs of his coalition partners in order to keep a stable government.
Well, it's quite a balancing act for him, isn't it? Gregg Roman, Middle East Forum Director, thank you for sharing your time and insights. We appreciate it, Gregg.
Thank you.